Welcome everyone. Very excited to see so many folks on the call. My name is Kathleen Brophy. I use she, her pronouns, and I will be emceeing our webinar tonight. At the top of the call, I'd like to hand it off to my colleague, Erica, who can give us some information and guidance on the language justice components of tonight's webinar.
Thank you, Kathleen, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Erica T. Patterson. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the campaign director for climate and environmental justice with ACRE. I'm here with Yaya and Alexia, who are interpreting into Spanish, and Glashanda and MJ, who are interpreting into ASL, and with Austin and Isela, who are doing cart captioning in English and Spanish, respectively.
Gracias, Kathleen. Bienvenidos a todos. Muchas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros esta tarde. Soy Erika Ty Patterson, pronombres ella, y soy directora de campañas para la justicia climática y ambiental con ACRE. Estoy aquí junto a Yaya y Alexia, que estarán haciendo interpretación al español, y Closhanda y MJ, que están interpretando la lengua de señas norteamericana. Austin y Isela también estarán proveyendo subtítulos en vivo en inglés y en español, respectivamente.
To access English language captions, click on the arrow next to the button that says CC at the bottom of your screen and select Show Captions. To access Spanish language captions, click on the link that you'll find in the chat. And a note, this session is being recorded.
Para acceder a los subtítulos en inglés, haga clic en la flecha cerca del botón que dice CC en la parte inferior de su pantalla y seleccione Mostrar subtítulos. Para acceder a los subtítulos en español, haga clic en el enlace que encontrará en la caja de chat. Y un aviso, esta sesión está siendo grabada.
The Language Justice team is here today to interpret between English, ASL, and Spanish, and to provide captioning, working within a framework called Language Justice.
El equipo de justicia del lenguaje está aquí hoy para interpretar entre inglés, la lengua de señas norteamericana y español, y para proporcionar subtítulos, trabajando con un marco que se llama la justicia del lenguaje.
Language justice includes a commitment to everyone's full presence and capacity to communicate in our languages. We acknowledge all the languages here today, and especially the languages of the indigenous people of this land.
Today, this event will be held in English and Spanish with interpreting into ASL. Both English and Spanish will be actively used. So if you're not comfortable communicating in both, you will choose a language channel in a few moments. Hoy este evento se va a llevar a cabo en español y en inglés con interpretación a la lengua de... Disculpen, la justicia del lenguaje incluye el compromiso de la presencia plena de todos y la capacidad de comunicarnos en nuestros idiomas. Reconocemos todos los idiomas presentes hoy aquí y en particular los idiomas de los pueblos indígenas de esta tierra.
We'll be using the Zoom interpreting function, which is already activated. If you're joining from a computer, you will see a globe icon on the bottom of your screen. If you're joining from tablet or phone, click on More, and you'll see a menu that will include an option called Language Interpretation. If you can't see the globe or the language interpretation option, contact me, Erica, to get help. To listen to the interpreting, click the globe icon or language interpretation, then choose your language channel. If you are using a tablet or phone, make sure to click on Done once you choose your language. Now we're going to do a quick test of the interpreting function, and Yaya will finish this announcement so I can be available for tech support.
Okay. Como se mencionó anteriormente, esta sesión se va a dar en español y en inglés con
Like it
interpretación.
was mentioned, This is going to be both in English and Spanish with interpretation to ASL. So if you do not feel comfortable in both languages, you will be able to select a language channel. We're going to use the language interpreting tool that's been activated yet.
Si se está conectando con su tableta o teléfono, pulse en más y verá un menú que incluye la opción de interpretación de idiomas. Si usted no puede ver el mundo o la opción de interpretación de idiomas, puede ponerse en contacto conmigo, con Erika, para recibir ayuda. Para escuchar la interpretación, pulse el icono de mundo, interpretación de idiomas. A continuación, elija su canal de idioma. Si está usando una tableta o teléfono, asegúrese de hacer clic en finalizar después de coger su idioma. Ahora vamos a hacer una breve prueba de la función de interpretación y ya terminará este anuncio para que yo pueda estar disponible para ofrecer apoyo técnico. Primero, voy a hablar un poco en inglés. I'm
So
going to speak
first, I'm going
in English. So please raise your hand if you can hear the interpreting in the Spanish channel. Ahora voy a hablar un poco en español. Por favor.
And now I'm going to speak a little bit of Spanish. Please just give me a thumbs up if you can hear the interpreter, Alexia, in the English channel.
Si no hay problemas, vamos a
Okay,
continuar la
if
parte de
everything
interpretación
is okay, we're
para
gonna
todo este
use simultaneous interpreting for the rest of this
Ahora,
announcement.
participantes
So now
en
everyone who
este
prefers to participate in a single language should be in a language channel. People who speak both English and Spanish can either keep the interpreting function turned off or choose a language channel. If you do choose a language channel, please speak only in that language. You can also click mute original audio to hear just the interpreter. If you cannot hear the interpreter, please do not suffer in silence and use the chat box to request help. With the goal of language equity, we're going to limit the use of the chat box to tech needs and questions. And if you have a question for the presenters, please write it in the chat. It could either be in Spanish or English. We'll be sure to respond all of the questions in the resources we send out after this event. Folks who understand Spanish will have noticed we use the E instead, ending instead of traditional A or O. For example, when we said bienvenidos or welcome as we begin, and this is not a pronunciation error, but a very intentional effort to create inclusive spaces to avoid making any assumptions about people's genders. Finally, thank you so much to STMP, including partners, the Action Center on Race and the Economy, Positive Money US, a Public Citizen, and the Sunrise Project for making it possible for us to be here today. We are so pleased to be able to support this multilingual space since we feel strong solidarity with the work you do. And thank you for your attention. And now we can officially begin. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our everybody on the language justice team. We are really happy to be able to collaborate together to kind of provide and facilitate a more just space when it comes to language and communication. And we're always in a journey of trying to kind of figure that out. So I hope the participants can also be excited about that and really do lean on the support in the tech, our support provided. Reach out if you're having issues with the tech. So as I said, my name is Kathleen. I use she, her pronouns, and I work at the Sunrise Project. I'm also on the core organizing team for Stop the Money Pipeline for this series of webinars. I have no qualifications to be your MC tonight, other than I despise corporate greed and everything that it does. And I'm really happy to, alongside all of you, learn about the role of private equity in driving not only climate change, but oppression and exploitation of all sorts. This is a webinar installment in our multi-part webinar series on toxic money. So in our first two webinars, we introduced the topic of climate-related financial risk and then walked through some important financial regulators and their role in mitigating these risks. So we focused so far on the Office of the Comptroller of Currency as a very key bank regulator that can potentially help in forcing some of the banks and financiers of fossil fuels and other destructive industries to close off financing to those industries in important ways. We also, in our last webinar, covered the Federal Reserve, which has a huge role to play in stewarding safety and soundness within the entire US financial system and economy. Much of our work and campaigning on climate-related financial risk focuses on Wall Street, because Wall Street is financing the climate crisis, as many of us know, but it's also financing so many other forms of oppression and exploitation across many industries and sectors. Tonight, we're focusing on, as you saw us call it, Wall Street's evil twin. And like me, you might be wondering, how could that be? How could it get more evil than Wall Street? And it is a good question. Unfortunately, it can. So tonight we're going to be talking about private equity, which is an industry in and of itself, of kind of private financing to some of these industries that are causing climate change, that are causing environmental destruction, and kind of financing some of these industries that wreak havoc on frontline communities. And so what we'll do tonight is we'll walk through the basics. So what is private equity? Why should we care about it? What does it have to do with our work? We'll hear from speakers and experts on kind of how financial regulation matters to private equity. We'll then be presented with findings from some important reports on private equity in the energy sector. And we'll also hear from Kendra Pinto, who will help us understand and ground this kind of abstract conversation in the real impacts of the fossil fuel industry on frontline and Indigenous communities. It's important to us at Stop the Money Pipeline that, especially on issues of financial risk, which can be very kind of, like I said, abstract and theoretical, to continue to ground in the lived experience of people who are every single day facing the impacts and consequences of the continued financing of these industries. So with that, I'll just introduce our speakers and get right into it, because as I already confessed, I'm absolutely, I have no idea what this topic is, and I want to get to the experts. So first we'll be hearing from Alyssa Giacchino, who's the Campaigns and Research Director at the Private Equity Stakeholder Project. We'll then hear from Ricardo Valadez, Private Equity Campaigns Director at Americans for Financial Reform, followed by Oscar Valdez, who's a policy researcher at Americans for Financial Reform. We'll then hear from Amanda Mendoza, who's Climate Research and Campaign Coordinator at Private Equity Stakeholder Project. And finally, Kendra Pinto, who's the Four Corners Indigenous Community Field Advocate at Earthworks. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it off to Alyssa to get us started.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. Hi, everyone. Alyssa Giacchino with the Private Equity Stakeholder Project. I prefer she, her pronouns. I am calling in from Ohlone Land in the Bay Area. Thank you to the Stop the Money Pipeline Coalition and to all of you who are spending part of your evening with us and giving us the opportunity to talk about private equity, which is a shadowy force helping to drive climate change with very little accountability. And today, our goal is to shed a little light on this secretive industry. So you can move to the next slide. Private markets are growing and have grown enormously over the past 2 decades. At this point, they manage an approximate $9.8 trillion. Last year in 2021, private markets funds raised a record of almost $1.2 trillion. The number of US companies operating in the private markets keeps growing, while at the same time, the number of companies traded on public stock markets is shrinking. So you can see on this slide, private equity backed companies grew to 8,000, while over the same period, publicly listed companies dropped by about half. That shift to private markets means that the public has very limited information, and private equity firms use that secrecy to make billions. In fact, private equity is basically a billionaire factory. It has created obscene wealth for its executives using aggressive tactics that often leave a wake of wreckage for workers and communities to deal with after the firm walks away. Next slide. So, who invests in private equity? Whose money are we talking about anyway? Only accredited investors are allowed. So that means mostly institutional investors like pension funds, in other words, retirement capital for public workers and corporate employees, sovereign wealth funds, and insurance companies. And you can see in the pie chart there on the slide that public pension funds allocate around 20% of their portfolio to private funds, and that continues to grow. When an investor commits money to a private equity fund, they become a limited partner, meaning they give up most control. The money is also locked up for a period of about 10 years, so not like stocks or bonds that you can buy and sell at any point. Private equity firms use the money that they raise to basically flip a bunch of companies. They buy them, load them up with debt, cut costs, extract money through fees, and sell them off in a couple of years. Private equity funds charge exorbitant fees that are confusing, obscure, and often shady. The private equity firms take a big chunk of the profits. But when things go badly, it's investors that eat the losses. Either way, private equity firms make their money. Next slide, please. So we're here talking about climate. Private equity is a significant investor in fossil fuels, but there's not much visibility into what they really own. Research shows that the exposure is massive. In a report last fall, we at the Private Equity Stakeholder Project found that private equity had invested over 1.1 trillion in energy in the past 10 years, the overwhelming majority of that in fossil fuels. Private equity firms are fueling the climate crisis and environmental injustice with investments in fracked gas, offshore drilling, liquid natural gas terminals, import and export, pipelines, coal and gas plants. This massive ownership of dirty energy by private equity is concerning enough, but they are also buying fossil fuel assets from public companies. So this is the evil twin of Wall Street side. ExxonMobil, Occidental Petroleum, ConocoPhillips, those are all publicly traded. They're under pressure from the public, from regulators, from activists and shareholders to cut their carbon footprint. They are selling off their oil fields and private equity is buying it to keep on drilling. You have utilities selling off old gas or oil plants, coal plants. Private equity buys those plants and keeps on polluting. The lack of transparency around private equity is largely due to the fact that the industry is only lightly regulated by our financial oversight agency, the Securities and Exchange Commission. It is my pleasure to turn over to Ricardo from Americans for Financial Reform to talk more about the regulatory agency.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. My name is Ricardo Valadez, and I'm the Private Equity Campaign Director for Americans for Financial Reform. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm joining this evening from occupied Piscataway territory in the Washington, D.C. area. As Alyssa mentioned, private equity firms are Wall Street companies that raise money from institutional investors and the very wealthy to buy companies, saddle them with debt, strip the companies of their assets, including slashing jobs and compromising worker safety, all with the end goal of selling the companies at a profit with little regard to anyone who's impacted by their looting. Now, most people never learn about private equity abuses until they hear about major retailers like Toys R Us failing. But the problem, as Alyssa was talking about, the problem is much bigger than that. As Alyssa mentioned, the private equity industry has ballooned. It's grown from around $1 trillion in 2008 to nearly $4.5 trillion today. And that means that private equity firms control about 11.7 million jobs in the US. But here's one of the catches about private equity is the vast majority of the companies owned by private equity firms are private, which means they're not subject to the same reporting standards and detailed financial and operational information that public companies have to disclose. In fact, generally speaking, private equity owned companies can choose what types of information they'd like to share with the public and their investors, and they can say different things to different people. So why does that matter? Well, in the last decade, private equity companies have collected a whopping $230 billion in fees. And that's money that should have stayed with investors like pension funds that support workers like nurses and teachers and state and local workers when they retire. And without detailed reporting from private equity companies, those institutional investors who manage those retirement funds don't have access to critical information on the private equity's fees, performance, or even what they're investing in. So this lack of public information on private equity companies limits investors' ability to make the best financial decisions for the workers that they represent. But here's the good news. The Securities and Exchange Commission, also known as the SEC, has begun taking measures to rein in private equity. The SEC, as Alyssa mentioned, is an independent federal regulatory agency whose mandate is to protect investors, maintain fair and orderly function of securities markets, and facilitate capital formation. And the next training in this series will be focused entirely on the SEC. So I won't dive into that more at this time. But for now, the SEC is calling for private equity to provide more disclosures on the companies that they own to the SEC. The SEC is proposing 2 new rules which will help shed light on private equity companies. The first proposed rule calls for protections for institutional investors like pension funds who invest in private equity. Private equity firms tout high returns for savers, but often exaggerate their success while hiding fees that they charge compared to lower fee alternatives like index funds that may do just as well, if not better. Now, under the proposed rule, the SEC would require comparable numbers on performance and fees so that funds that invest workers' retirement savings have the information, the same way nutrition labels let people figure out how to eat healthy. The second proposed rule will require public companies to make annual climate-related financial disclosures, like their vulnerability to climate disasters, and also their current levels of greenhouse gas emissions and whether they have a strategy to address their climate-related financial risks. The SEC's climate disclosure proposal rule will impact a few private equity companies whose stocks are publicly listed, typically the largest ones that have the largest fossil fuel operations and generate the majority of financed emissions. Some public private equity companies include Blackstone, KKR, Carlyle, Ares, Apollo, TPG, and Brookfield. The new climate disclosure rule will require these PE firms to list their finance emissions, which is the emissions that come from their portfolio companies, including fossil fuel power plants, pipelines, and industrial facilities. But there's currently a loophole. Firms will only need to list these emissions if they determine they are material to investors. We need the SEC to change that provision so all the firms need to report those emissions, because PE firms will likely say that they're not material to investors, even though they make up the vast majority of their emissions, far behind those created by their buildings, servers, and employee commutes. The measures that the SEC are taking are imperative in getting private equity companies to publicly disclose critical information to investors and members of the public. Information that will help protect investors from exorbitant fees and climate-related financial risk. And with that, I will pass to my colleague, Oscar.
Thank you, Ricardo. Gracias, Ricardo. My Mi presentación es en español. Hola a todos, mi nombre es Oscar Valdez y soy un
Hello, my
investigador.
number is Oscar Valdez, and I'm a research for Americans for Financial Reform. My pronouns are him, and I am talking from Occupy Piscataway lands, what is now known as Washington, D.C. My brief intervention is to present the results from a new investigation, and when my colleagues and I, we examined the inversions, the investments from private equity to power plants and electrical plants of more than 1 megawatts connected to the electrical grid. They directly finance more than 700 power plants and have the combined capacity of more than 150,000 megawatts in the United States. Of those 700 power plants, we found that 205 of those power plants use fossil fuels in the energy production. Of these, 217 use natural gas with 97,000 megawatts, 15 uses carbon with 18,000 megawatts, and 23 producing electricity using oil and has 4,000 megawatts. The capacity of these power plants based on fossil fuels represent the 80% of the total megawatts produced by power plants, property of the private equity firms and their subsidiaries. On the other hand, the renewable energy sources of these companies only represent 40% of the total capacity of these companies. In total, the capacity in terms of the produced megabytes by burning fossil fuels is 5 times more than those generated by renewable sources. And we calculate from these power plants, they produce at least 200 millions of metric tons of carbon dioxide, in addition to other dangerous contaminants like methane and fine particular contamination that is associated to adverse effects like pulmonary and cardiac illness in the neighboring populations to this power plants. To put the 200 million metric tons of carbon dioxide in context, if we put it on a country level, these emissions will put the private equity firms on as a number 31 of the more polluted countries before Spain and in front of Argentina.
Y para concluir, la capacidad de generación y las emisiones de las compañías de capital privado están mayormente concentradas en un pequeño grupo de 10 compañías. El top 10 de estos inversionistas acumulan el 81% de la capacidad y el 84% de las emisiones. Entre estas compañías se encuentran algunas como las que mencionó Ricardo y otras como Energy Capital Partners, Riverstone Holdings o el grupo Carlyle, del cual vamos a escuchar más en la presentación siguiente por mi colega Amanda Mendoza con la organización Private Equity Stakeholder Project. Muchas gracias. Amanda.
Hello, everyone. If we could go to the next slide. My name is Amanda Mendoza. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the climate campaign coordinator for Private Equity Stakeholder Project, and I'm calling in from Tongva Hashiman Land, or the Long Beach, California area. Thank you, Ricardo, for explaining the regulatory challenges with private equity and the new proposals that are upcoming in this space. Also, Oscar, thank you for your informative presentation on private equity involvement in US power plants across the country. Now I would like to focus on one private equity firm in particular, one of the largest private equity firms with $300 billion in assets under management, the Carlyle Group. Carlyle has roughly $24 billion in fossil fuels, owning dozens of oil and gas companies, and also through a major stake in another firm called NGP Energy Capital.
These include, as Oscar highlighted, gas-fired power plants in the Northeast, as well as drilling operations in Texas, Oklahoma, South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, Carlyle's billionaire co-founder and co-chairman, David Rubenstein, has raked in huge profits from these dirty fossil fuel investments, contributing to our climate crisis and harming our communities, while using his fortune to greenwash his reputation by donating millions of dollars to prestigious cultural institutions and universities and sitting on their boards. We'll turn our attention to him again, specifically a bit later. If we could go to the next slide. For now, we'd like to give some specific examples of the local, national, and global impacts of Carlyle's seemingly insatiable appetite for fossil fuels. A prime example of a private equity firm acquiring assets from publicly traded oil majors that are looking to shed some of their exposure to climate risks due to public pressure, as Alyssa mentioned earlier, happened in 2020 when Occidental Petroleum sold its entire onshore drilling portfolio in Colombia to Carlyle for $825 million. Another asset, Colgate Energy, owned by NGP, is a drilling company that has emitted toxins in close proximity to Spanish-speaking low-income neighborhoods in Texas. Oil and gas drilling is one of the nation's largest sources of methane pollution, and methane has more than 80 times the warming power of carbon dioxide. At least 25% of today's warming can be attributed to methane, especially from the oil and gas industry. And NGP's Blackbeard operating was found to be a major contributor to our methane problem. A 2021 Ceres and Cleaner Task Force study found that Blackbeard emitted 6 times the amount of methane as Chevron. And now I would like to highlight Carlyle's joint venture with Hillcorp Energy. If we could go to the next slide. Thanks. Carlyle partnered with Hillcorp Energy, a major oil and gas company, in 2015 in a lending deal in order to acquire oil and natural gas assets across North America. And in a press release that came along with the deal, Carlyle said that, quote, "We are thrilled to be partnering with Hillcorp." And not surprisingly, Hillcorp's methane emissions have been found to dwarf those of ExxonMobil. And in 2017, the Carlyle Hillcorp joint venture agreed to buy ConocoPhillips's San Juan Basin assets in New Mexico for $2.7 billion. And now I'll send it back to Kathleen.
Great, thanks, Amanda. Sorry about that. Very, very helpful and informative so far. And I'm really happy to introduce Kendra into the conversation. I mentioned Kendra before, but wanted to give a little bit of an intro. Kendra is a young Diné woman from the Eastern Agency of the Navajo Nation. Kendra has a BA in Environmental Studies from Fort Lewis College and works with earthworks within her community within New Mexico to document frontline communities' impacts and the injustices brought in by industrial extraction by pushing to create spaces for impacted communities hosting federally funded energy infrastructure projects. From capturing air samples for testing to engaging directly with state and federal officials, she continues to advocate for clean air and clean water in the greater Chaco Canyon region, a rural area under target for oil extraction, as Amanda just explained to us. So Kendra, really happy to welcome you and your contributions.
Thank you, Kathleen. Yat-A, my name is Kendra Pinto, and I'm in northwestern New Mexico within the Eastern Agency of the Navajo Nation. I am a certified thermographer, and I operate a flare camera while out in the oil fields. My priority is Indigenous frontline community members who are living with and among oil and gas well sites. At Earthworks, we provide a handy tool that makes the invisible gases visible. The call for help is one that is rarely answered from within a community that is experiencing extraction. And more times than not, the people do not know where or who to turn to report an odor or an accident that happens on an oil and gas site. For example, a rancher who may be gathering his horses may notice a gassy odor in the air, maybe something like rotten eggs, and the smell doesn't go away even after he leaves the immediate area. Who is responsible for this type of activity? This is where I can help using the flare camera. A quick rundown of what happens during a field visit. 1, I receive a request from a community member. 2, we discuss the major concerns, like how far an oil and gas site is from the house, and determine a potential visit date. 3, once we go over the details, I make my way into the field. When I approach the site, I am aware not to trespass or put myself in harm's way. Next, I do a slow sweep over the site with the flare camera. Should I find emissions activity, I then began to take field observations, such as the site operator, site name, weather conditions, and then I set up a tripod to stabilize the camera. Once that's all done, I am then able to begin recording footage of the emissions while taking notes on the origin of the escape point. There are several filters that can be used during this process. The most common filter used is the grayscale and high sensitivity mode. Once the videos are edited, and I then use the online portal to submit complaints with the New Mexico Environmental Department, using the footage as the strongest evidence of what is found and happening on site. Sometimes the complaints have a response, sometimes they don't. In reality, any methane and VOC emissions complaints should be taken seriously, especially when the site is venting or flaring less than a mile from a residential home or school. What we need to understand is that even if I go out to 24 sites in one day and find maybe 4 sites that are intermittently venting, that number increases tremendously when you consider the size of the oil field or any area. Here in the San Juan Basin, the estimated number of oil and gas sites is over 40,000. Increased instances of asthma, headaches, nausea, nosebleeds, and fatigue are among the most reported by community members living near oil and gas sites. As a matter of fact, while doing field work in mid-March, I myself had 3 nosebleeds after returning home. Normally, I deal with headaches and fatigue, so this most recent field work did have a major physical impact on me. Now compare that to the folks who are surrounded by methane and VOC emissions on a daily basis. Linking the health impacts to oil and gas activity is a costly effort that most communities cannot afford and implement. That creates an environmental injustice for communities of color. What public services are provided to those who bear the brunt of the negative impacts of extractive industries? That question should be addressed in all frontlines communities. Next slide. The example videos I have with me today were taken during a couple of field visits within the past year on a ranch located in northwestern New Mexico. Venting emissions is a major concern when it comes to the impacts on the immediate surrounding environment, but also to the people living relatively close. You'll notice as the video is playing, the emissions wafting off the top of this dump tank on site. Can you play the other video actually, please? Thank you. Thank you. You'll notice as the video is playing, the emissions wafting off the top of this dump tank on site. While we were on site, there was a very strong gassy odor detectable, and we tried our best to stay upwind. This is a major concern when we think about climate change and how we as humans are impacting the environment. We know methane is 84 to 86 times more potent than carbon dioxide. We know routine venting and flaring is adding toxic pollutants to the air and land. What we don't know is whether or not each and every single site created by outside industries is properly maintaining the equipment and infrastructure of the oil and gas operations. What we don't know is the measured amount of methane and volatile organic compounds is being released into the air. Quantifying the harm methane is doing to the environment can only be done if we know every single chemical compound that is escaping from the equipment on site. And at this point, we don't have a complete list of what is being used during hydraulic fracturing. If you have that list, please do send it to me. A major issue that affects the area in which I reside, the Chaco Canyon area, is the checkerboard issue. What that means is that there are several different types of land management: federal, state, tribal trust lands, allotment, and private. This creates a complex situation for folks in that area. These are just a few of the issues that plague communities with extraction. What I and folks at Earthworks can do is directly help the impacted individuals. Listening to and reporting their concerns using innovative technology is a step in the right direction, but we must remember it has to be a continuous push. If we want to go to the next slide. The last video on your screen is a site that had a very large plume of emissions, basically wafting off the waste dump tank. So what you're looking at is pretty much a mixture of oil, gas, and water, or wastewater with hydrocarbons. The volatile organic compounds can be seen off-gassing into our atmosphere. This video was taken about 3 weeks ago. We did detect very strong odors while we were on site, and we have visited this site 5 times over the course of 3 years. Keep in mind that here at Earthworks, we use the same flare cameras that the oil industry, New Mexico Environmental Department, and the New Mexico Oil Conservation Division use. If you would like to view additional flare videos taken in New Mexico and other states, you can find them on our YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and search Earthworks. All the footage we record is uploaded to this channel. Ahead, and thank you for this time, and I will hand it back over to Amanda.
Thank you so much, Kendra. That was super powerful. Thank you for sharing just the real world effects that just some of these Hillcorp oil and gas operations are having on our land and on our communities. From there, I want to turn our attention back to David Rubenstein again. Just a reminder, he's the co-founder and co-chairman of Carlyle, who we briefly mentioned earlier in the webinar. He's worth $4.6 billion, and he's been the most recognizable face of Carlyle for decades. The quote here is from 2015. Rubenstein had said that Carlyle was, quote, very bullish on the energy sector. In fact, we'd say probably there's no other sector in the world that we're as bullish on as we are on energy. And I want to go to the next slide so we can show you just kind of how big David Rubenstein's reach is. Aside from serving as a Harvard trustee, he serves as the chairman of the Kennedy Center for Performing Arts, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Economic Club of Washington, D.C., and the National Gallery of Art. He's also a trustee at the University of Chicago. And we can go to the next slide. And even though this industry, as we talked about tonight, as a whole, it operates in the shadows. But we can take action now to hold some people accountable, including David Rubenstein. So if you guys want to join me, we'll take some action tonight. Carlyle, they've been cashing in on the climate chaos. They hold $24 billion in fossil fuel, and they've said they intend to buy more. They're not slowing down. So we say it's time for the Kennedy Center, the National Gallery of Arts, and Harvard University to drop David Rubenstein from their boards. We ask you to please take a moment right now to visit cleanupcarlyle.org and help us put some pressure on the Carlyle Group to clean up their act and by calling on these institutions, the Kennedy Center, National Gallery of Art, and Harvard Corporation, to cut ties with David Rubenstein and with Carlisle. So we'll go ahead and drop the link in the chat. And the website, if you are able to, it allows you to easily tweet as well as generate emails to these institutions. There's a couple hundred of us here today, which we're very grateful for, and for you guys to stick around. So if we each send out these emails, we could flood their inboxes right now. Thank you, Austin. As you can see on the screen, is going to be scrolling down to fill out some of these forms. We do want to acknowledge that this action page is in English. However, you can still take this action. And if you see the white boxes with the photograph on top, there we are. Those are already populated with a letter. All you have to do is fill out your first name, your last name, your email address, and then click on the big blue Take Action button. And it will go ahead and send those emails off. You may do this for all 4 forms. Thank you all so much. Please let us know in the chat once you've submitted your forms. Thank you again for taking the time to join us today. Thank you, Stop the Money Pipeline Coalition, for inviting us to speak on private equity, and for Americans for Financial Reform and Earthworks for their amazing work and contributions. Thank you so much. I'm going to send it back to Kathleen.
Great, thanks so much, Amanda. And I also just want to echo Amanda's thanks for every speaker tonight. As I alluded, I started with as much knowledge as many of you joining the call. So I'm very grateful for the time and energy that everybody's taken, not only to help kind of demystify this intentionally complicated part of our financial system, but also to help ground it in what these sorts of far away, behind closed doors deals mean in terms of consequences for people on the ground. So we just want to take a few minutes to let people take that action. We'd love to make sure that that happens. Greenwashing is a hugely important part of kind of the game for a lot of these companies and CEOs. And so kind of removing Rubenstein's ability to greenwash his image will help really accurately portray and depict who he really is and what he stands for. And so we do want to take away some of these vehicles for greenwashing and hope that some of these institutions will provide that sort of leverage for us to do that. So hopefully the form that our colleagues have that this awesome Take Action site, hopefully it's easily understandable. If not, you can please let us know in the chat, but hopefully it's pretty doable to send those few emails off. And we really appreciate people taking the time to do that. Great, I'm really glad to hear it. Awesome. Great, thanks for letting us know. Really happy to see that progress in the chat. Great, awesome. We'll just take another minute or two to let folks fill that out. Awesome. Well, like I said, very, very grateful for all of our speakers tonight, our language justice team, and my fellow colleagues at Stop the Money Pipeline. This whole webinar series is trying to help us all kind of collectively better understand the financial system and the impacts of the financial system on fueling climate change, environmental destruction, and environmental injustice. The financial industry, I think, intentionally kind of keeps itself in its own orbit, but it really is connected to and grounded in real world consequences. And it's really helpful to understand the impacts of private equity on the real economy, on people, and on the climate crisis. So I'm very, very grateful for all of our speakers and helping us kind of get to that understanding tonight. Next up in our series, like some folks alluded to, we'll be talking about the Securities and Exchange Commission. The Securities and Exchange Commission plays an important role in requiring disclosures from all sorts of companies asset managers, a lot of different, and banks, a lot of the different financial targets. And while disclosure is not the end all be all, that sort of information can help expose some financial risks that companies are intentionally concealing. So for instance, fossil fuel companies are increasingly financially risky from an investment standpoint, and that's something that they would like to keep to themselves. So how can the SEC play a role in helping to require information that will help the market, but also all of us better understand the risks, the financial risks that is involved in a lot of these companies, and also the asset managers and the banks that are facilitating and financing these companies. So similar to our last webinars, we will kind of tease out the, try to demystify the complexities of the Securities and Exchange Commission and make it kind of help folks understand why it matters within our fight against climate change, against corporate power. So please do join us. We'll send out more information about that to everybody who joined this call. So please look out for that, as well as some follow-up materials that folks can, that will send folks through email that will provide some more information on things we discussed tonight. Again, I really appreciate everybody taking the time, our speakers, but also all of you as participants. I know that it's not easy to, especially this time of year, to spend your night in front of a computer, and I really appreciate everybody's kind of energy and enthusiasm for this issue. And I really look forward to seeing you all again soon. So thanks so much.